We're down at the bottom of Argentina, the very southern end of Argentina. And curiously enough, there's been people here for a very, very long time. Over on the Chile side, there's a site called Monteverde. And at Monteverde, they have found some human remains, and they have dated them to 12,500 BC. So we're talking about some bones that are some 14, 15,000 years old. And that makes them some of the first bones that are found in the Americas. Now that's very curious because people had been bottled up a long time before that, actually up in Alaska, but they couldn't get down into North America until around 14, 15,000 years ago. And then all of a sudden you find human remains all up and down North and South America. It didn't take them very long once the passages opened up, and they couldn't have walked that distance that fast, that far. Now, as a practical matter, what that leaves is that in order to get people that quickly into South America, they have to come by boat. They could come through the South Pacific or the maritime route down from Canada, or maybe even from Europe or Africa. The area of Argentina that we're going to is called Tierra del Fuego, that is the land of fire. And it's called the land of fire for a good reason. The early explorers, when they discovered people down there, the natives really didn't seem to remember very well how to make clothes. So in order to keep warm, what they did was they built fires, and so there were fires burning just about everywhere. Tierra del Fuego is part of a larger area generally called Patagonia. And Patagonia means something like big feet. And in fact, the early explorers that were in this area, Magellan and so forth, did tend to report that the natives were a little bit taller than Europeans were. But it may not be the feet of the Patagonians that got them their name. Instead, there was a book written by Francisco Vasquez called Primalian of Greece. It was written in 1512, and in it there's a character called Patagon. Now, Patagon is a very rough character, eats raw meat, very uncivilized, and it's this character that may have inspired the name Patagonia. You see, we know that this was a very popular book. Magellan probably had read it several times, and we're talking about the year 1520, 8 years after the book was written.
There once was a man, his name was Magellan, a Portuguese skipper, the girls found him cute. He sailed with 5 ships to find the East Indies, then come back to Spain with a bounty of loot. Whoopee-tie-I-O, oh happy Magellan, starting your journey with hardly a care. Whoopee-tie-I-O, strong brave Magellan, you'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where. They crossed the Atlantic and spotted a country. Magellan said,
"It's the East Indies at last!"
But then someone shouted,
"Hey, that's Argentina!"
Magellan got cranky and chopped down the mast. Whoopee-tie-I-O, settle down, Magellan. Put down that axe, there's no time to despair. Whoopee-tie-I-O, keep trying, Magellan. You'll find the East Indies, you just don't know where.
Now, one of the things that you don't want to do when you're going sailing from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean below South America is to go through the Drake's Passage. The weather there is terrible. Some of the worst sailing in the world is through Drake's Passage. So there are people always looking for ways to avoid that. And in fact, Magellan found one. He found what is now called the Straits of Magellan. It's a passage through an archipelago of islands down at the bottom of South America, but it gives you a relatively safe passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In addition, there is another passage, and this is called the Beagle Channel, and it is named after the HMS Beagle. The Beagle is the ship that, among other things, was carrying Darwin on his trip around the world. It spent about 2 years navigating the Beagle Channel so that it knew where every rock and every shoal was along that channel, so that British ships would not get stuck going through this relatively narrow channel. And we're going through the Beagle Channel. We're flying down to Ushuaia, Argentina. Now, Ushuaia bills itself as the southernmost city in the world, and the fact of the matter is, if you set a ripple going directly east or west from Ushuaia, it would go all the way around the world and hit South America again without hitting land. And so it could very well be the furthest south city in the world. The word itself is an Indian name. The Aya at the end means the bay, and the Ushua, well, that means western or westward. So this is the western bay on the Beagle Channel, and it has had a population for a very long time, but it was quite small. What got this place started really was the fact that, well, there was a competition between Argentina and Chile for this particular part of South America, and the British had a pretty heavy presence here as well because of the Beagle and the British Navy and so forth. And the result of that was that the Argentines began to become concerned that they were going to lose control of this unless they established a substantial population. The fastest way to establish a population down here and an ideal use for this particular territory would be to build a prison, and so that's what they did. So in 1902 the prisoners started building the jail, and they continued to build it until 1920. The original idea was to build a penal colony there, and in 1920 the jail had 5 pavilions with 79 exterior-facing cells each. The 380 cells were single, or intended for individual people, but the jail housed more than 600 convicts at one time. There was a bakery, workshop, and in 1943 there was a modern hospital there, and that hospital is still there for the existing naval base. And the reason for that is because eventually the horror stories about the jail leaked out, and the government had to close it down and turn it into a naval base instead. In 1947, Juan Perón, Evita's husband, who was president at the time, actually closed the prison down. But while the prison was in operation, they did a lot of construction, and they needed a lot of fuel, and in order to do that they cut a lot of timber. There are forests in the area, but bringing it back was something of a small problem, and so a small railroad, a narrow gauge railway, was built. The train used to take prisoners from the prison out to the forest where they collected wood. Today it just takes tourists out to the national park. At the railway station, everybody queues up for multiple trips on the various locomotives. They have several of them. And there are people dressed up in costumes so that they're sort of reenactors. And a number of them are dressed up as prisoners. the train generally runs towards the west, into the forest, and the prisoners that were there, for the most part, didn't try to escape. And the reason they didn't try to escape was because there was frankly no place to go. One of the prisoners, named Pipo, did escape, and he was found a few days later, frozen to death near the little river that the train runs along. And as a result of that, this little river is called Pipo, after the prisoner that was frozen to death. So effectively, Ushuaia was Argentina's version of Devil's Island.
Back to the west, traveling along the eastern slopes of Mount Susana, crossing the Pipo River several times, and ending its journey when it entered the Cañadón del Toro. As soon as they arrived, the prisoners were forced down off the cars to start their working day, guarded by an inner circle of unarmed jailers who gave out orders, and a second ring of guards armed with rifles. Meanwhile, the engine drivers took advantage of the meltwater at the Macarena Falls to fill up the tanks of the locomotive. Swathes of forest at the foot of which grow ferns, mosses, and grasses that spread over almost the entire national park and can be seen along the entire route of the train. The predominant trees are of the genus Nothofagus, southern beeches, the lenga beech, a common tree in the area, mire, or Antarctic beech, and guindo, or Magellan's beech. The forest offers views that change according to... Also in open ground, a feature of trees growing in isolation is the twisted shape formed by the strong winds. These are known locally as flag trees. Of particular note is the emblematic Andean condor, considered to be the king of the Andes, a soaring, majestic presence on the slopes of the mountains in the southern skies. Black in color, it can be identified by a white ruff that adult birds have around their necks.
You've probably noticed that out the window there are a number of old stumps, and many of those were created when the prisoners chopped down trees, and all those stumps are not necessarily the same height. The higher ones indicate that there was more snow when that tree was cut.
Among the native fauna seen in Tierra del Fuego's National Park, the most colorful mammal is the red fox. Its thick reddish fur helps it survive the winter, and its main prey are rabbits. Hunting the red fox is now banned.
Just as Ushuaia is the southernmost city in the world, this is the southernmost railway in the world. Meanwhile, back in Ushuaia, there's something interesting that I happen to notice in some of the city signs. The Malvinas are what the Argentines call the Falklands. The Falklands, of course, are British, and the Argentines and the British fought a war over them quite recently. And the Argentines have not forgotten. Specifically, they haven't forgotten the Belgrano. Now, the Belgrano was originally a U.S. cruiser, the USS Phoenix. However, during the war with the British over the Falklands, the Belgrano was hit by a British torpedo and sunk. And the result of that is a rather severe embarrassment to Argentina, but also something that they don't want to forget. And they're not forgetting about the Falklands, and they intend to turn them into the Malvinas as soon as they get a chance. However, our interests are with a different ship entirely. Our ship is a Russian icebreaker named the Kapitan Kolebnikov, and the captain has come in during the night, and it is now in the Ushuaia harbor, taking on supplies and preparing to let us board her for our trip down to Snow Hill Island. Now, Snow Hill Island is the northernmost island where you can find emperor penguins and their chicks at this time of year. Ushuaia is the southernmost port in South America, and as a result of that, it is probably ideally suited, or more ideally suited than any other city, to be a jumping off point for polar expeditions. In fact, most polar expeditions begin at this particular port. Now, the captain is ideally suited for this trip, and the reason is because it is a real icebreaker. And if you take a polar trip, a polar cruise anyplace, you're likely not to be taking an icebreaker. But there are special ships that are set up to be polar cruise ships. This ship is set up to be an icebreaker, and the result is you can go places where you can't go with a polar cruise ship. And if you go to Snow Hill Island at this time of year, you can't reliably get there in a polar cruise ship. You really have to have an icebreaker for reasons that will probably become obvious. Now, here's the trip as it appears on the map. Ushuaia is clearly indicated, and the red lines are basically the way that we're sort of going to be going to get down to Snow Hill Island, and you can see that that's the northernmost point that you're going to get in Antarctica. The alternate route is through the Chilean port of Punta Arenas, and that's a good port. Many ships come out of that one as well, headed for the Antarctic. So for all practical matters, this trip really depends on the Kapitan Kolebnikov in order to assure its absolute success. And it's the captain that makes this trip extremely interesting. And so now it's time to leave Argentina and head down to Antarctica and the emperor penguin chicks.
cry for me, Argentina. The truth is I never left you. All through my wild days, my mad existence, I kept my promise. Don't keep your distance. Have I said too much? There's nothing more I can think of to say to you. But all you have to do is look at me to know that every word is true.